Dr. Hendricks arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag in hand and his expression professionally grave. He was a man of 60, with the efficient manner of someone who had spent decades attending to the village's ailments and emergencies. His daughter Daphne watched anxiously as he examined Patricia's arm, his capable fingers probing the wound with gentle thoroughness. "Not as bad as it might have been," he pronounced, his voice carrying the reassuring tone of a doctor accustomed to calming nervous households. "The cut is deep but clean. No arterial damage, thankfully. She'll need stitches and proper bandaging, but there's no permanent harm done. The shock is worse than the injury, I suspect." Patricia, lying on the sofa now with her arm elevated, nodded weakly. She was a woman of striking appearance, dark hair threaded with grey, sharp cheekbones, eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Yet at this moment she looked genuinely fragile, her earlier composure shattered as thoroughly as the vase scattered across the floor. "What on earth were you doing standing so close to the window?" Dorothy asked, her tone hovering between concern and mild reproach. "The floors are so slippery. And you were in your stockings, weren't you?" Patricia closed her eyes. "I was looking at the garden. The afternoon light on the roses, I was going to paint them. And I turned too quickly, I suppose. My foot caught on something, the carpet fold perhaps, and I lost my balance. I grabbed at the vase to steady myself, but it came away, and then I fell." She opened her eyes. Everything happened so very fast. Miss Marple, standing quietly near the fireplace, observed the scene with the meticulous attention of a naturalist studying the behavior of birds. She watched the way Catherine's fingers gripped the mantelpiece, the slight tension in her shoulders. She noticed how Martin Crane had moved to the window, ostensibly to examine the broken fragments on the sill, but positioning himself so that his back remained turned to the room. She saw how Daphne hovered near her father, her usual composure replaced by a nervous energy that seemed excessive for a simple accident. "I'll need to stitch this properly," Dr. Hendricks announced, rising with his bag. "Best we move her somewhere more comfortable. The library, perhaps." As the household mobilized to assist the doctor, moving Patricia carefully from the drawing room, Miss Marple bent to examine the scattered porcelain more closely. The pieces were small, jagged, and numerous, a vase of considerable age and artistry reduced to fragments. She picked up one piece carefully, noting its weight, the delicacy of its construction. A Ming vase, someone had said. Valuable then. "Terrible waste," said James, coming to stand beside her. He was the youngest of the Ashworths, 30 years old, with his father's build but his mother's nervous disposition. "That vase was insured, I hope. It must have been worth a considerable sum." "Do you know its history?" Miss Marple inquired pleasantly. James shook his head. "Father acquired it years ago. He's rather fond of collecting beautiful things. Mother always said it was too fragile to keep on display, but Father insisted. He liked having it in the drawing room, where it could be seen. Facing the window, as it was." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale eyes moving from the broken vase to the window to the carpet beneath her feet. There was indeed a slight fold in the Persian rug, the sort that could trip an unwary foot. And yet... "Tell me," she said conversationally, turning to James, "was Miss Hendricks in the drawing room before the accident?" "The room seemed quite empty when I heard the crash." James appeared confused by the question. "I'm not certain. I was in my room when it happened. I came down immediately when I heard the noise." "Why do you ask?" "Merely curiosity," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and harmless. "A young woman so devoted to her art, I imagined she might have been sketching the roses Patricia mentioned. Daphne." James considered this. "I don't know. I didn't see her until after Father had called the doctor. By the time Dr. Hendricks had finished his work in the library, evening had fallen with the swift descent that autumn provided." Patricia was resting comfortably, sedated by a mild draught, her arm properly bandaged and stitched. The household gathered for a subdued dinner, the accident lending a strange tension to the meal that no one quite addressed directly. Miss Marple sat between Catherine and Martin Crane, observing the interplay of glances and silences that characterized the conversation. Catherine seemed preoccupied, pushing food about her plate without eating. Martin, by contrast, ate steadily, though his jaw worked somewhat too hard, suggesting tension beneath his composed exterior. Dorothy fretted about Patricia's comfort, while Richard reassured everyone that insurance would cover the loss of the vase. Only Daphne seemed entirely unaffected, chatting lightly about village gossip and the upcoming autumn festival. And yet, Miss Marple noticed, she did not once look directly at anyone as she spoke. Her eyes remained fixed on her plate or the middle distance, as though deliberately avoiding engagement. It was as Miss Marple was preparing for bed that evening, reviewing the day's events in her methodical way, that a curious thought struck her. The blue vase facing the window. Patricia had said she was looking at the garden, at the roses. But the roses at Thornfield grew on the eastern wall, visible from a completely different vantage point. The window where the vase had stood faced south, toward the village rather than the garden. Why, Miss Marple wondered, had Patricia lied about what she had been looking at? And more importantly, what had she actually been observing? The morning that followed the accident brought with it the peculiar quality of revelation that only daylight could provide. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and taken a solitary walk through the gardens of Thornfield before breakfast. The autumn air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and dying leaves. She had moved methodically through the grounds, observing the layout of the house from various angles, noting which windows overlooked which sections of the property, and, most particularly, examining the view from the drawing-room window where the blue vase had stood. The roses that Dorothy had mentioned in her gardening conversations grew indeed on the eastern wall, visible from the morning room and the library, but not from the drawing-room window. From that particular vantage point, one could see only the gravel drive, the village road beyond it, and the hedgerow that bordered the estate. Miss Marple stood at that very spot for several minutes, her hands clasped before her, her expression thoughtful. When she returned to the house, she found the breakfast room already occupied. Richard Ashworth sat reading the Morning Post, his expression grave. Catherine stood at the sideboard, apparently selecting toast, though she seemed unlikely to eat it. Martin Crane was nowhere to be seen. "Good morning," Miss Marple said pleasantly, settling herself at the table. "I trust everyone slept well, despite yesterday's excitement?" "As well as one can, given the circumstances," Richard replied, folding his newspaper with deliberate care. "I've already had a telephone call from my insurance agent. The vase was indeed insured, though the paperwork will be tedious. I'm told these things always are." Catherine set down her plate with more force than seemed necessary. "I'm certain we all wish Patricia a swift recovery and would prefer not to dwell on the financial aspects of her accident." There was an edge to her voice that made Richard look up sharply. Catherine had always been the dutiful daughter, but lately Miss Marple had observed there seemed to be a brittleness beneath her composure, as though she were maintaining control through sheer force of will rather than genuine equanimity. "Of course," Richard said mildly. "I merely meant—" "I know what you meant, Father," Catherine interrupted, then appeared to regret her sharpness. "Forgive me. I slept poorly." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Dorothy, who had just entered the breakfast room with her characteristic morning brightness somewhat dampened by concern for their injured guest. "How is dear Patricia this morning? I do hope the sedative allowed her proper rest." "Dr. Hendricks checked on her before dawn," Dorothy reported. "He says the wound is clean and healing well. She's awake now, though still rather drowsy. I've arranged for her breakfast to be brought to her room. The poor dear should avoid exertion for at least 2 days." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured. "I wonder, did anyone speak with her about exactly how the accident occurred? The details, I mean. Sometimes in moments of shock, one's recollection can be rather confused." Dorothy looked surprised by the question. "Well, she explained it to us yesterday, didn't she? She was looking at the garden, at the roses," Miss Marple supplied gently. "Yes, she did say that. And yet I took a walk this morning, and I noticed that the roses bloom on the eastern wall. The drawing-room window faces south, toward the village. Most of the view is of the drive. And the road beyond—" There was a moment of silence. Richard lowered his newspaper. Catherine's hand froze halfway to her mouth. "Does it matter?" Catherine asked carefully. Perhaps Patricia was confused about which roses she meant to paint. It was an accident, after all. "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, her tone remaining perfectly pleasant. "Accidents can be frightfully disorienting. I merely wondered if anyone had thought to examine the window itself. Sometimes, when one falls in proximity to glass, there are small details, scratches perhaps, or indications of how the vase might have come away from its position." "The police aren't involved," Richard said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "It was an accident, clearly. There's no need for anyone to investigate anything." "No, of course not," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "I was simply thinking aloud. You know how elderly people are. We notice the oddest things and become fascinated by them for no particular reason. There was a similar incident in my village, you see, many years ago. A woman fell, a valuable object broke, and it turned out to be the most ordinary accident imaginable. Though the circumstances were rather interesting. Interesting how? Martin Crane had appeared in the doorway, immaculately dressed despite the early hour, his solicitor's composure firmly in place. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. The woman who fell had actually been looking out the window at something entirely different from what she claimed. She was watching her husband's carriage leave the drive. She had been distressed about his departure, you see, and when asked about her accident, she invented a different reason for being at the window. Pride, perhaps, or simply embarrassment about her emotional state. Martin moved to the sideboard, his movements controlled but something flickering behind his eye. Yes, a tension, a quickening of interest. "And was there any significance to that deception?" "Not to the accident itself," Miss Marple replied. "But it did suggest that the woman was not as unconcerned about her husband's movements as she had claimed. People so often lie about the most innocent things, don't they? Simply because they fear judgment or wish to maintain a certain image." Catherine rose abruptly from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "If you'll excuse me, I think I'll visit Patricia. She may need something." As Catherine left the room, Miss Marple observed the direction of Martin Crane's gaze, the way it followed Catherine's departure with an intensity that suggested something far deeper than mere courtesy. And she remembered quite suddenly that it was Catherine's engagement to Martin that had been broken 5 years ago. Catherine, the dutiful daughter who had returned to her father's house. Catherine, who seemed to spend a great deal of time looking out windows, her expression unreadable. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though Miss Marple was far too experienced to voice her thoughts prematurely. Instead, she finished her breakfast with her customary composure and asked Dorothy about the autumn festival preparations as though nothing whatsoever had changed. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had positioned herself in the library with her knitting, a location that proved strategically advantageous for observing the household's movements without appearing to do so. The library overlooked the main hallway, and its open door provided an excellent vantage point for anyone passing through the house. She had learned long ago that the best observations came not from deliberate investigation, but from patient, unobtrusive presence. Patricia's room was on the first floor, and between 10 and 11 o'clock, she received a succession of visitors. Dorothy came first with fresh flowers and inquiries about comfort. Daphne appeared shortly after, her visit brief and purposeful. But it was Catherine's extended absence that caught Miss Marple's attention. She had left the breakfast room at 8:30 and had not reappeared for over 2 hours. When Catherine finally did emerge from Patricia's room, her face was flushed and her eyes bright with unshed tears. She moved quickly down the hallway without seeing Miss Marple, her composure visibly strained. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose to follow at a discreet distance. Catherine made her way to the morning room, a smaller space adjacent to the drawing room where the accident had occurred. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, observing without entering. Catherine had positioned herself at the window, her forehead pressed against the glass, her shoulders trembling slightly. She remained in that posture for several minutes before straightening herself with visible effort, as though physically collecting the pieces of her facade. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently from the doorway, making her presence known. "Is something troubling you? You seem quite distressed." Catherine started, spinning around with an expression of mingled surprise and alarm. "Miss Marple, I didn't hear you approach. I'm afraid I have a habit of moving quietly, Miss Marple said apologetically. A consequence of age, I suppose. One's footsteps become rather insubstantial. But please don't let me intrude. I was merely concerned. Catherine attempted a smile that failed spectacularly. It's nothing. Simply the shock of yesterday's events catching up with me, I think. Miss Marple entered the room and settled herself in a comfortable chair without being invited, a privilege of age that allowed her to breach social conventions with impunity. Patricia seemed quite upset when I encountered her maid in the hallway. I do hope her injuries aren't worse than Dr. Hendricks initially assessed. No, Catherine said quickly. No, the injury is healing well. It's just... She was asking questions about the accident, about the circumstances. It unsettled me, that's all. Questions about what precisely? Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, conversational, utterly non-threatening. Catherine sank into a chair with the exhaustion of someone maintaining a pretense she could no longer sustain. She wanted to know if anyone had seen her before she fell. She seemed concerned that we might think she had been deliberately positioned near the vase, that the accident wasn't actually an accident. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. What a curious notion. Why would anyone imagine such a thing? Because, Catherine said, her voice dropping, the vase was valuable, and Patricia mentioned needing money. She spoke about her paintings not selling, about financial difficulties. Someone, I can't remember who, made a comment about the insurance, and Patricia became quite defensive. She said she would never do anything so foolish as to deliberately injure herself for money, yet someone has suggested that was precisely what occurred. Miss Marple asked softly. Not directly, Catherine said. But there are looks, implications. The household staff gossip, and gossip has a way of becoming accepted as fact. Patricia heard someone mention that the accident was convenient, that it solved her financial problems nicely. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression thoughtful. How distressing for her. And for you, it seems, though I confess I'm curious about why her predicament should affect you so considerably. Catherine looked away. She's a guest in our house. My father's carelessness in displaying such a valuable object near a window where someone might brush against it. It feels like a failure of hospitality. I should have ensured she was safe. It was a reasonable explanation, and yet Miss Marple detected the familiar ring of a half-truth. Catherine's concern for Patricia seemed genuine, but it was layered beneath something else, some deeper anxiety that her words could not quite conceal. You know, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking in their steady rhythm, in my village, there was a shopkeeper's wife who suffered a similar circumstance. She had an accident, you see, and the shop's inventory was damaged. But what interested me most was not the accident itself, but rather the web of relationships that had led to it. The wife and the shopkeeper had not been getting along, you understand. And there was another woman involved, someone the shopkeeper had been seeing. The accident occurred on the very day the shopkeeper had announced his intention to leave his wife. Catherine's head turned sharply toward Miss Marple. What happened? The truth emerged, Miss Marple said simply. As truth so often does, when one is patient enough to wait for it. The accident, it turned out, was not quite the accident everyone believed. But that is neither here nor there in terms of your situation, I'm sure. I was merely thinking aloud about how accidents often occur at the precise moment when tensions within a household have reached their apex. Are you suggesting that someone in this house deliberately orchestrated Patricia's fall? Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm suggesting nothing of the sort, Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting. I am merely an elderly woman who spends far too much time making connections between unrelated events. Pay me no mind, dear. I'm sure the accident was exactly what it appeared to be. A moment of carelessness, unfortunate timing, and nothing more. But as she watched Catherine's face, Miss Marple saw the flicker of something that suggested her words had struck home with considerable force. Catherine turned back to the window, and in her reflection Miss Marple could see the shadow of knowledge, the terrible, burdening weight of understanding something that could not be easily explained or dismissed. The afternoon brought a change in the household's rhythm that was subtle but unmistakable to anyone attuned to such shifts. By 2 o'clock, word had spread among the servants that Patricia was receiving no more visitors, Dr. Hendricks having advised complete rest. This development seemed to agitate Richard Ashworth considerably. He spent the latter part of the morning closeted in his study with the telephone receiver pressed to his ear, his voice rising and falling in tones that suggested agitation rather than his usual measured demeanor. Miss Marple observed all of this from her position in the conservatory, where she had relocated her knitting station with the pretext of enjoying the afternoon light. From this vantage point, she could hear the murmur of Richard's telephone conversation through the adjoining wall, not the words themselves but the cadence and emotion behind them. He was arguing with someone. The discovery fascinated her in the way that human behavior always did. It was James who first provided clarity on the nature of his father's distress. He appeared in the conservatory at 2:30, his expression nervous, carrying a silver tray with tea and biscuits that he set before Miss Marple with the air of someone performing a duty rather than offering hospitality. "Father's in rather a state," James offered, hovering awkwardly. "Has been all morning. I'm not entirely certain what's happened, but I believe it has something to do with the insurance claim for the vase." "How troublesome," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "Insurance companies can be frightfully difficult, can't they? I once knew a woman whose claim was denied because the insurance agent discovered she had moved the insured object from its originally documented location. The most technical of interpretations, but apparently binding." James shifted his weight uncomfortably. "That's just it, Miss Marple. I overheard Father speaking to the insurance agent. The vase's location was documented in the policy, and apparently it was supposed to be in the drawing room but on the west wall, not the south wall where it actually stood. There's some question about whether the policy covers it at all if it was in a different position than specified." "How very inconvenient," Miss Marple mused. "I wonder why your father moved it from its originally documented location." "I haven't the faintest idea," James said. "Father hasn't mentioned anything to me about it, but it seems to be creating a considerable difficulty." After James left, Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The pieces were beginning to form a more coherent picture, though she remained cautious about drawing conclusions prematurely. The vase had been moved from its documented location. Patricia's accident had occurred at precisely the spot where it now stood. Richard Ashworth was distressed about the insurance implications, and Catherine, dear, troubled Catherine, seemed to be laboring under some considerable burden of knowledge or guilt. It was at tea time that the next crucial development occurred. The household gathered in the drawing room, and Miss Marple noted with interest that several things had changed. The carpet fold that had supposedly tripped Patricia had been straightened. The spot where the vase had stood had been thoroughly cleaned. And most tellingly, there was a new vase in its place, a more modest object, clear, not of the same value or historical significance as its predecessor. Richard presided over tea with a stiffness that suggested he was barely maintaining his composure. Dorothy chattered nervously about village matters, her words flowing in an anxious stream that filled the uncomfortable silences. Martin Crane sat near the window, his solicitor's mind clearly working through some legal problem. And Daphne, who had been largely quiet since the previous morning, kept glancing toward the hallway as though expecting something to materialize. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple said conversationally, accepting a cup of tea from Dorothy, "about the history of valuable objects in English homes. How often it happens that something precious is moved from its original position, sometimes for aesthetic reasons, sometimes for practical ones. I once knew a woman who moved a beautiful painting because the light coming through a particular window was fading it. She explained to her insurance company, of course, but it caused no end of bureaucratic difficulty." Richard set down his teacup with a sharp clink. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that I should have informed my insurance company about the vase's relocation?" "Oh, I wouldn't presume to advise you on such matters," Miss Marple said gently. "I was merely making conversation. Insurance is such a tedious subject, though I do think it's important that people are honest with their insurance agents. Dishonesty, even by omission, can lead to the most dreadful complications." There was a heavy silence. Catherine's face had gone quite pale. Martin was studying Miss Marple with an expression of dawning comprehension, and Richard looked as though he had swallowed something exceedingly bitter. "The vase was moved approximately 3 weeks ago," Richard said abruptly. "I did not inform the insurance company because I saw no reason to do so. Oh, it remained in the same room, merely repositioned for better visual effect. I considered it a minor matter." "Ah," said Miss Marple, as though this clarified everything. "And was there a particular reason for moving it at that precise time?" 3 weeks ago, you say? That would have been mid-September. "I fail to see how that's relevant," Richard snapped. But Miss Marple had observed something that caused her to press forward, despite his irritation. Catherine had clutched her teacup so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. And in that moment, Miss Marple understood that Catherine had known about the vase's repositioning. More than that, she had likely been the one to suggest it, or perhaps even to move it herself. The question that now consumed Miss Marple's attention was not whether the accident had been staged, but rather for whom it had been staged, and what exactly Catherine Ashworth had been trying to accomplish by orchestrating Patricia's fall at the very spot where her father's relocated uninsured vase stood waiting to be destroyed. That evening, Miss Marple found herself unable to settle into her usual bedtime routine. She sat in her room, still fully dressed, her hands folded in her lap as she turned over the events of the past 2 days, like a jeweler examining a stone for hidden flaws. The picture was becoming clearer, but clarity brought with it troubling questions that demanded answers. At 9 o'clock, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door. She rose and, opening it quietly, observed Catherine passing by with a shawl drawn about her shoulders and a determined expression on her face. Miss Marple recognized that particular set to a woman's jaw, the expression of someone about to do something they had been contemplating for some time but had not yet found the courage to execute. Following at a discreet distance, Miss Marple discovered Catherine making her way toward Patricia's room. She paused outside the door, her hand raised as though to knock, then lowered it again. She stood there for nearly 5 minutes, wrestling with some internal conflict before finally pressing her knuckles against the wood. Miss Marple positioned herself in an alcove near the staircase, close enough to observe the door opening, but far enough to remain undetected. Patricia appeared, dressed in a nightgown, her injured arm cradled carefully. The 2 women spoke in low tones, their conversation inaudible but their body language eloquent. Catherine's shoulders were hunched with tension. Patricia's expression moved from confusion to comprehension to something that looked remarkably like sympathy. When Catherine finally departed, Miss Marple noticed that her eyes were wet with tears, though her face remained composed. Whatever had transpired between the 2 women, it had been consequential. The following morning brought a revelation that shifted everything. Miss Marple was taking her usual early walk when she encountered Dr. Hendricks arriving at the manor with his medical bag. His expression suggested something beyond the routine checkup he had presumably come to perform. She greeted him pleasantly and inquired about Patricia's progress. "Healing well," the doctor said, but his tone suggested preoccupation. "Though there's been a development. Miss Hendricks mentioned something to me this morning that I found rather troubling. She apparently overheard a conversation between her father and Miss Ashworth some years ago. Richard Ashworth's financial situation is not as secure as the village believes. He's been experiencing difficulties with his investments, and he had asked for a substantial loan from Patricia's father, who refused him." Miss Marple digested this information carefully. How very awkward for everyone involved. "Indeed," the doctor said. "But what troubles me more is that Miss Ashworth seems to have been laboring under the assumption that the accident might somehow benefit the household. She mentioned something about insurance to Patricia, as though relieved that it had occurred. It was an odd remark, and Patricia was sufficiently disturbed by it that she felt compelled to tell me. After the doctor had gone, Miss Marple sat in the conservatory and reviewed her thoughts with the methodical precision of a chess player considering multiple moves ahead. Richard Ashworth was in financial difficulty. He had moved the vase to a position not covered by his insurance policy, deliberately, she now suspected, not accidentally. Catherine, his daughter, had somehow been involved in or had known about this repositioning. And then Patricia had arrived, a woman whose father had refused Richard a crucial loan. The accident had destroyed the vase. If it had occurred before Richard's policy change became an issue, it would have been covered. But it had occurred after, which meant the destruction actually represented a loss. Unless, Miss Marple thought, there was something else entirely at work. She found Martin Crane in the library, reading the morning newspaper with the air of a man deliberately avoiding conversation. She settled herself across from him without ceremony. "Tell me, Mr. Crane," she said without preamble, "why did your engagement to Miss Catherine end 5 years ago?" Martin lowered his newspaper slowly. "That's a personal matter, Miss Marple. I'm not certain it's appropriate. I'm an old woman with an insatiable curiosity about human nature," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "and I suspect you're the sort of man who values honesty, so I'm asking directly, why did the engagement end?" Martin was quiet for a long moment. Catherine's father disapproved. He felt I didn't have Suffy. Scient prospects. He suggested that a solicitor from a provincial village would never be able to provide adequately for his daughter. Catherine, unfortunately, allowed herself to be influenced by his opinion. "And has that situation changed?" Miss Marple asked. "Have your prospects improved?" "Considerably," Martin said. "I became a partner in my firm 3 years ago. I'm now in a far stronger financial position than I was then. And does Richard Ashworth know this?" "He should," Martin said quietly. "He lives in the same village. News travels." Miss Marple rose from her chair. "I wonder, Mr. Crane, if you've given any thought to renewing your acquaintance with Miss Catherine? A second engagement, perhaps?" Martin's eyes widened. That would depend entirely on whether Catherine shared such a desire." "Oh, I rather suspect she does," Miss Marple said. "I suspect she has for quite some time. And I suspect that her father's financial difficulties have made a reconciliation between the two of you particularly urgent in her mind. Perhaps too urgent. Perhaps urgent enough that she might have considered taking rather extreme measures to facilitate it." As Miss Marple left the library, she was fairly certain she understood what had happened. But understanding the mechanics of deception was not the same as comprehending the emotional truth beneath it. And before she could act, she needed to understand not merely what Catherine had done, but why, and whether the line between self-preservation and deliberate harm had truly been crossed. The confrontation Miss Marple had been orchestrating came to fruition that afternoon, though not in the manner she had anticipated. She had intended to speak with Catherine privately, to offer her the opportunity to explain her actions before Miss Marple took any irreversible steps. However, fate, or perhaps the simple momentum of accumulated tension, intervened in the form of Richard Ashworth's collapse. He suffered what appeared to be a severe anxiety attack in his study, his breathing becoming labored, his complexion turning an alarming shade of grey. Dorothy called for Dr. Hendricks immediately, and within the hour, the doctor had administered a sedative and pronounced Richard's condition stable but requiring rest. The incident rattled the household considerably. Whatever anxieties Richard had been concealing suddenly became undeniably real to everyone around him. It was in this atmosphere of heightened tension that Miss Marple finally found Catherine alone in the library, ostensibly searching for a novel but actually staring out the window with the fixed gaze of someone whose mind was elsewhere entirely. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, closing the library door behind her, "I think perhaps we should talk about what actually happened 2 days ago." Catherine's entire body went rigid. She did not turn around. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Miss Marple said, settling herself in a comfortable chair. "I think you know precisely what I mean. You moved the Ming vase from its properly documented location in your father's insurance policy. You did this deliberately, knowing that if it were destroyed while improperly positioned, it would not be covered. Then you ensured that it would be destroyed by arranging for Miss Hendricks to have an accident at precisely that spot." Catherine turned to face her, her expression a mixture of defiance and despair. "You can't possibly know?" "How?" Miss Marple asked. "Because I've lived a very long time and have observed human nature in all its complexity. Because you made the mistake of being inconsistent about the roses you supposedly were admiring. because your distress when speaking with Patricia was far too acute to be merely sympathy for an injured guest. And because, my dear, I have learned that people who commit desperate acts do so only when they are desperate indeed. Your father's financial situation must be dire for you to have considered such an extraordinary scheme. Catherine sank into a chair, her composure crumbling entirely. You don't understand. Father is ruined. The investment's failed. There's almost nothing left. He's been hiding it for months, pretending everything is normal. But the reality is that we're facing financial ruin. The estate will have to be sold. Everything will be gone. And so you conceived this plan to recover the insurance money, Miss Marple said, her tone neither judgmental nor condoning. But it required that Patricia suffer an injury. Tell me, did you intend for her to be hurt, or did you merely intend for her to be present when the vase fell? I didn't know she would cut herself so badly, Catherine said, her voice breaking. She was supposed to stumble, the vase was supposed to fall, and everyone would assume it was an accident. The insurance would pay, Father's immediate crisis would be averted, and no one would be truly harmed. I loosened the vase's positioning so it would come away easily. I arranged the rug fold to trip her, but I didn't anticipate that she would grab at it, that the porcelain would shatter in such a way. And yet, Miss Marple observed, there is another consideration. Your father moved the vase after you had positioned it, which means he was aware of your plan, or at least aware that something was amiss with the vase's placement. Catherine's face went very pale. Father didn't know. He couldn't have. I never told him. Then why did he move it? Miss Marple pressed. Why would he relocate it to a position equally uncovered by insurance? There was a long silence. When Catherine spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I don't know, unless he somehow discovered what I had done and decided to move it to make the scheme even more effective. But that would mean he was part of it, and he assured me he knew nothing. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out over the grounds of Thornfield with the expression of someone contemplating a puzzle that had just become considerably more complex. Tell me precisely what your father said when you told him about the vase being repositioned. I didn't tell him, Catherine said. I thought it best he didn't know. If the authorities ever questioned him, I wanted him to be able to answer truthfully that he had nothing to do with it. But he moved it anyway, Miss Marple murmured. Which means either he discovered your alterations through his own observation or someone told him. Someone who understood what you were attempting and had their own reasons for modifying your plan. Catherine stared at her. Who would do that? Miss Marple turned from the window, her pale eyes sharp with understanding. Someone who stood to benefit from a different outcome than the one you had envisioned. Someone who perhaps saw an opportunity not merely to help your father financially, but to manipulate events toward their own advantage. Someone, my dear, with access to your father's study and intimate knowledge of his financial affairs. The implication hung in the air between them. Catherine's hand moved to her mouth as understanding began to dawn. James, Catherine whispered. You think James did this? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that we need to have a considerably more detailed conversation about the events leading up to that accident. Because if I'm correct, your brother has committed a crime far more serious than insurance fraud. And that vase, my dear, may not have been the only casualty he intended to engineer. The revelations that followed came in careful increments, each piece of information building upon the last like blocks in an increasingly precarious tower. Catherine, once the dam of her composure had broken, proved willing to discuss matters she had clearly been wrestling with in solitude for weeks. James, it emerged, had been present when Catherine first conceived her plan. She had mentioned it to him in a moment of familial desperation, seeking his counsel as someone with a legal mind who might advise her on the feasibility of her scheme. Instead of dissuading her, James had listened intently, asking detailed questions about the vase, its positioning, the insurance policy, the specific mechanics of how she intended to orchestrate the accident. He seemed sympathetic, Catherine explained, her voice hollow. He said he understood Father's predicament. He even helped me practice how I would position things, where I would place the rug fold. I thought he was supporting me. But now I wonder if he was actually planning something entirely different. "What changed?" Miss Marple asked. "When did you first suspect that James's involvement had extended beyond mere counsel?" "The morning after the accident," Catherine said. "I overheard him speaking with Father in the study. He was suggesting that perhaps the insurance company should be contacted immediately before they heard about the accident through other channels. He was very insistent about it, and very particular about the wording Father should use. It seemed odd at the time. I had imagined Father would simply file a straightforward claim, but James was coaching him, suggesting specific language, particular emphases. "Insurance fraud," Miss Marple murmured, "but orchestrated in a way that would implicate both your father and yourself should the truth emerge. A rather elegant trap, actually. You would be caught in the act of conspiracy, your father would be implicated in a false claim, and James would position himself as the innocent member of the family, horrified by his relative's dishonesty." "But why would he do that?" Catherine asked, bewilderment evident in her voice. "He's part of this family. He stands to lose everything if Father loses the estate." "Does he?" Miss Marple asked. "Or does he perhaps stand to gain something more valuable than an entailed property? Tell me, my dear, what is James's actual financial situation? His work in the city, is it genuine or is it merely a cover for something else?" Catherine's expression shifted. "I'm not entirely certain. Father gives him an allowance, but James claims he makes a substantial income from his position. He's always been somewhat secretive about it. Mother asked about it once, and he became quite evasive." Miss Marple rose and moved toward the door. "I think we need to examine James's room. And I think we need to do so with considerable care, because I suspect that what we will find there will shed light on motivations far darker than simple financial embarrassment." The search of James's room proved illuminating in ways that transcended Miss Marple's already considerable suspicions. Beneath the floorboards of his wardrobe, concealed with the care of someone accustomed to hiding things, they discovered a collection of documents that painted a picture of extraordinary complexity. There were financial records detailing payments from sources other than his claimed employer. There were letters, carefully preserved, that suggested James had been conducting a private enterprise entirely removed from his official position. And, most damningly, there were insurance policies, not merely on the Ming vase, but on his father's life, taken out without Richard's knowledge, with James listed as beneficiary. Catherine gasped when Miss Marple produced this final document. "He's insured Father's life. For how much?" £50,000, Miss Marple said quietly. "Taken out 6 months ago. That is a considerable sum." "He's planning to kill Father," Catherine whispered, the words seeming to escape her mouth unbidden. The accident was supposed to be the beginning. Patricia was supposed to be the first death, to test whether accidents could be orchestrated and overlooked. And then once he understood the mechanics, once he had practiced on someone else. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Miss Marple was already moving toward the door. "We need to fetch Dr. Hendricks immediately. Your father requires protection, though I suspect James's plans have been significantly disrupted by our discoveries. However, there is another matter that troubles me greatly." "What matter?" Catherine asked, following her into the hallway. "Patricia's accident," Miss Marple said. "If James deliberately modified your plan by moving the vase to an uninsured position, then he did so knowing it would cause the insurance claim to fail. Which means he had a different objective in mind. He needed Patricia to be injured. The question is why? They found Patricia sitting in her room, her arm properly bandaged, color returning to her cheeks as her body healed from the relatively minor injury she had sustained. She looked up as Miss Marple and Catherine entered, surprise crossing her features. "My dears, is something wrong?" Patricia asked, her artistic eye immediately detecting the distress evident in Catherine's expression. Miss Marple settled herself carefully on the edge of the chair near Patricia's bed. "I wonder, Miss Hendricks, if you would be willing to tell us the true reason you came to Thornfield as a guest. Because I suspect your visit was not quite as casual as it appeared." Patricia's composure fractured. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out toward Catherine with her uninjured hand. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you, but your father asked me not to. He said it would be complicated, that he needed time to explain things properly. "What did my father ask you not to tell?" Catherine demanded, her voice rising with an urgency born of dawning comprehension. Patricia took a trembling breath. "That he is my biological father. That my mother, before she married your mother's predecessor, was involved with Richard. That I was born of that liaison, and that he has spent decades supporting me secretly through my mother's brother, and then after his death, directly." The revelation hung in the air like a physical force. Miss Marple, watching Catherine's face as comprehension bloomed into understanding, knew that they had just uncovered the true motivation behind James's carefully orchestrated scheme. Patricia was not merely an injured guest. She was the living evidence of Richard Ashworth's greatest secret, a secret that, if revealed, could potentially alter the inheritance, the legitimacy of his children, and the entire structure of his estate, and James had intended her death to bury that secret forever. The hours that followed unfolded with the inexorable momentum of machinery that had been set in motion long before, and could not now be stopped. Miss Marple dispatched Catherine to fetch Dr. Hendricks, with urgent instructions to ensure he came alone and armed with the knowledge that Richard Ashworth required both medical attention and protection. She remained with Patricia, whose shock at having her carefully guarded secret exposed was compounded by the dawning realization that someone in the household had attempted to murder her. "I don't understand," Patricia said repeatedly, her voice hollow. "James was always kind to me. He helped me with my paintings. He introduced me to people in London who might commission work. Why would he want me dead?" "Because your existence threatens everything he believed would be his," Miss Marple explained gently. "Your father's financial difficulties have made the inheritance, the estate, the remaining assets, everything that constitutes his identity and future, dependent upon remaining exactly as it stands. An illegitimate half-sister, now appearing and potentially claiming rights to the estate or forcing your father to acknowledge you publicly, represents an unacceptable complication to his plans. But father's financial situation is dire," Patricia said. "An inheritance wouldn't save him. I heard Catherine mention it." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "The inheritance alone would not save him. But your death, coupled with a properly orchestrated accident that claimed another family member or two, would ensure that James inherited relatively quickly and without complications. Insurance policies on your father's life, combined with the estate itself, would constitute a fortune far exceeding any immediate financial crisis." The pieces had been rearranging themselves in Miss Marple's mind for the past hour, each revelation casting new light on previously incomprehensible actions. James had not merely conceived a scheme to exploit his father's financial desperation. He had used Catherine's desperation as a tool, her planned accident as cover for his own far more sinister intentions. He had positioned himself as the repository of family secrets, making himself indispensable while simultaneously gathering the leverage he needed to control outcomes. "The vase," Patricia said suddenly. "He moved it deliberately, knowing the insurance would not cover it. He wanted the claim to fail." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Your accident was supposed to create suspicion about whether it truly was an accident at all. The failed insurance claim would suggest fraud. Both your father and Catherine would become implicated in a conspiracy. And James would emerge as the shocked, disappointed family member horrified by their moral failings. The police would investigate the insurance claim, become tangled in the complications, and never look beyond the surface to question whether your injury was truly accidental." "But I survived," Patricia whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "You survived because James, for all his careful planning, could not entirely control the variables of physical reality. You were injured precisely as intended, but not fatally. And in your survival, you became a problem that required a more permanent solution." Before Patricia could respond, they heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Miss Marple rose and positioned herself near the door, listening intently. The footsteps belonged to James. She could identify them by the particular rhythm of his gait, a cadence she had observed and catalogued during her time at Thornfield. He was moving with purpose, heading toward the study where his father lay sedated. Miss Marple stepped into the hallway and intercepted him with the gentle authority of an elderly woman blocking a younger man's path. "Mr. James, a word, if you please." James's composure was remarkable. He stopped without resistance, his expression shifting to polite concern. "Miss Marple, I was just going to check on father. How is he?" "Resting comfortable," Miss Marple said, "though I suspect he will require considerably more rest once he understands the full extent of what his son has been planning." There was a moment, barely perceptible to anyone less observant, when James's mask slipped, his jaw tightened, his eyes went very cold. Then his expression reassembled itself into one of concerned puzzlement. "I'm afraid I don't follow you, Miss Marple. What has father been planning?" "Not your father," Miss Marple corrected gently. You have been planning. Rather extensively, I might add. The life insurance policies, the financial records hidden in your room, the careful manipulation of your sister's desperate plan for her own purposes. It was all quite clever, actually, the sort of scheme that might have succeeded with a less observant household. James's hand moved slightly toward his pocket. Miss Marple, noting the gesture, made a decision that had taken her decades of life experience to develop the confidence to make. She raised her voice, a sharp command that echoed through the hallway. "Dr. Hendricks! Mr. Crane, please come at once!" The summoning cry brought immediate results. Dr. Hendricks emerged from the study, his medical bag still in hand, while Martin Crane appeared from the library, where Miss Marple had previously asked him to remain. Both men took in the scene, Miss Marple blocking the hallway, James with his hand half extended toward his pocket, Patricia visible in her doorway behind them. "Mr. James Ashworth," Miss Marple said, her voice steady and clear, "has been attempting to murder his sister and frame his father and sister for insurance fraud. He has also taken out substantial life insurance policies on his father with the intention of collecting on them through carefully orchestrated accidents." The words hung in the air like an indictment. James's composure finally fractured entirely. His hand. Dee completed its movement toward his pocket, extracting a small revolver that he held with the desperation of a man whose carefully constructed plans were collapsing around him. "You've ruined everything," he said to Miss Marple, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I've worked for. Everything I've planned. Because you couldn't simply mind your own business and enjoy your holiday." "I'm afraid," Miss Marple said with genuine sympathy, "that I have never been particularly good at simply enjoying holidays. It's a failing of old age, I'm afraid. We elderly people are dreadfully inclined to notice things that younger, more focused individuals might overlook. And once one begins noticing things, one is compelled to follow the thread to wherever it leads." She took a step forward, unarmed and unafraid, and James, faced with the implacable compassion of an old woman who understood his motivations while remaining unmoved by them, let the revolver fall from his hand. The police arrived at Thornfield within the hour, summoned by Dr. Hendricks with the gravity of a man reporting a serious crime. They took James into custody with the efficient professionalism that comes from handling such matters regularly, though even their experienced eyes widened somewhat at the scope of the conspiracy laid bare before them. The insurance policies, the financial records, the carefully documented plan to orchestrate multiple deaths. It was the sort of case that would likely feature in legal textbooks for years to come. James offered no resistance beyond his initial capitulation. He sat in the drawing room, under the watchful eye of a constable, his earlier desperation having been replaced by a kind of hollow resignation. It was as though, once his meticulously constructed facade had shattered, he had nothing left to sustain him. The young man who had been so careful to maintain appearances now seemed to have abandoned any pretense of normalcy. Miss Marple observed him with the complex mixture of sympathy and clarity that came from understanding human nature in all its tragic dimensions. James Ashworth was not inherently evil, she recognized. He was simply a man who had allowed his ambitions and resentments to calcify into something destructive. His financial difficulties, for he had difficulties of his own, it emerged, his sense of entitlement to his father's estate, his resentment at being displaced in his father's affections by an illegitimate half-sister. These had all accumulated until he had convinced himself that murder was not merely justifiable, but necessary. Richard Ashworth, once apprised of the full extent of his son's betrayal, suffered a second, more severe collapse. Dr. Hendricks remained at Thornfield through the evening, administering care with the careful attention of a physician treating a man whose will to live had been considerably compromised. Dorothy maintained her composure through sheer force of maternal instinct, though the shock and grief etched themselves into the lines of her face with terrible clarity. It was Catherine who surprised Miss Marple with her resilience. Having been through her own crisis of conscience regarding the insurance scheme, Catherine seemed oddly prepared to face the larger catastrophe that had emerged. She sat with her father through the evening, holding his hand, speaking to him in low tones that Miss Marple could not hear, but whose effect was clearly palliative. Martin Crane remained as well, though ostensibly at Miss Marple's request. In reality, he had chosen to stay of his own volition, positioning himself as a source of practical legal counsel for the family's inevitable complications. More tellingly, he did not leave Catherine's side whenever propriety allowed. It was late in the evening, after the police had departed with James, and the household had settled into an uneasy quiet, that Miss Marple found Patricia in the conservatory, staring out at the darkened garden through windows that reflected the lamplight back at her in ghostly fashion. "How are you bearing up?" Miss Marple asked gently, settling herself in a nearby chair. "I'm not entirely certain," Patricia admitted. "A few days ago, my greatest worry was whether my paintings would sell. Now I've learned that my biological father is a man I've known all my life, that my half-brother attempted to murder me, and that my existence has somehow become the catalyst for a family tragedy. It's rather overwhelming." "Yes," Miss Marple said simply. "It would be, for anyone. Though I suspect, Miss Hendricks, that you're made of somewhat sterner stuff than your current exhaustion might suggest." Patricia turned to look at her. "How did you know? About father, I mean. About what he was to me." "I didn't, not initially," Miss Marple said. "But once I understood that James had deliberately sabotaged your accident, moving the vase to an uninsured position which made no sense unless he wanted the insurance claim to fail, I began to wonder what his true motivation might be. The answer had to be that your presence represented something far more threatening to him than a simple financial matter. And once I observed the resemblance between you and Richard, heard references to your mother and the timing of your birth, the rest became evident. "Will father recover?" Patricia asked quietly. "Physically, yes," Miss Marple said. "Emotionally, that remains to be seen. He has experienced a profound betrayal by his son, coupled with the revelation of a secret he has kept hidden for decades. The human spirit is resilient, but it requires time and often purpose." "And Catherine?" Patricia asked. "She was planning something terrible, herself." "Catherine was attempting to save her family from financial ruin," Miss Marple said without judgment. "She was willing to risk her own reputation and freedom to protect her father's honor. That's not the action of a wicked person, Miss Hendricks. That's the action of a desperate daughter who loved her father more than she valued her own safety. James, by contrast, was willing to destroy his entire family to gain financial advantage. The distinction between them is rather profound." Over the following days, as the household slowly returned to something resembling normalcy, Miss Marple observed the subtle reshuffling of relationships and understandings that trauma often precipitated. Catherine and Martin spent considerable time together, their conversations carrying the weight of people rediscovering what they had once shared. Patricia, having recovered physically, began to explore her complicated relationship with Richard, visiting him regularly and allowing him to speak of the circumstances that had led to her existence. Richard himself, though bearing the weight of his son's betrayal, seemed to find unexpected solace in acknowledging Patricia as his daughter. He moved about Thornfield with diminished vitality, but there was something almost peaceful in his acceptance of the truth he had hidden for so long. It was on Miss Marple's final evening at Thornfield that Dorothy thanked her, somewhat awkwardly, for her intervention in the matter. "I'm grateful, though I confess I wish the circumstances had been different," Dorothy said. "But I suspect without your insight, James might have succeeded in his plans. We might all have been destroyed." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps the truth would have emerged eventually, through some other mechanism. The human heart is remarkably difficult to deceive permanently. Truth has a way of surfacing, often when we Sent. Expected. The morning of Miss Marple's departure arrived with the particular quality of autumn light that had characterized her entire stay at Thornfield, golden, slanting, and imbued with a sense of transience. She stood in the drawing-room, her suitcase packed and waiting by the door, her knitting folded neatly in her lap as though she had not just spent the better part of 2 weeks unraveling the most intricate web of deception and malice. The household gathered to bid her farewell with the formality that such occasions required, though there was a palpable sense that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of Thornfield's inhabitants. Richard sat in his usual chair, his frame diminished by stress and revelation, yet his eyes carried a clarity they had previously lacked. Dorothy stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that had taken on new meaning in light of recent events. Catherine and Martin stood together with the comfortable proximity of people who had rediscovered understanding, while Patricia occupied a position that was simultaneously familiar and new, acknowledged and integrated into the family structure in ways that had previously been impossible. "You've been remarkably kind to us," Richard said to Miss Marple, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude and sorrow intermingled. "Despite everything that has occurred, despite the unpleasantness you've been forced to witness, I have merely observed," Miss Marple replied gently. "And, in observing, I have come to understand something rather important about the nature of families and the terrible burdens that secrets impose upon those who must carry them." Catherine moved forward, taking Miss Marple's hand with genuine affection. "What you did for us, for all of us, I'm not sure we can ever adequately express our gratitude. You saw through James's decepti. On when he was so carefully constructed, so convinced of his own righteousness." "Ah, but that was precisely the point," Miss Marple said. "James's conviction in his own righteousness was his greatest vulnerability. You see, truly wicked people, people who have genuinely surrendered their consciences to dark purposes, they carry themselves quite differently. They develop a certain brittleness, a guardedness that becomes almost visible to those who know how to observe it. But James believed himself to be justified. He believed that his father's financial failures, his own sense of entitlement to the family fortune, his resentment at being displaced in his father's affections, he believed all of these justified his actions. That particular combination of self-deception and moral certainty is far more dangerous than simple greed or malice, because it is so difficult to detect until one understands the motivations beneath it." Patricia stepped forward, and Miss Marple noted with approval the way that both Catherine and Richard turned toward her with expressions that suggested genuine concern and familial connection. "I wanted to thank you as well, not merely for preventing James from succeeding in his plan, but for making it possible for my father to acknowledge me. I spent so many years not understanding why he supported me, why he seemed to care for me in ways that exceeded simple courtesy. Now I understand, and somehow that knowledge makes everything else bearable. Truth is a remarkable healer," Miss Marple observed. "Not always a comfortable one, mind you, but remarkable nonetheless. Your father spent decades hiding a secret that caused him considerable pain. The irony is that revealing it, being forced to acknowledge you openly, has perhaps freed him from a burden he had grown so accustomed to carrying that he had nearly forgotten what it was like to exist without it." Martin cleared his throat, a gesture that suggested he had something he wished to contribute. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you would permit me a moment of candor. I've been contemplating something since the events of the past week, and I believe you're someone who would appreciate directness." "By all means," Miss Marple said. "When I first arrived at Thornfield, I had resigned myself to believing that my engagement to Catherine had ended permanently. I accepted that outcome because I believed it was what Catherine wanted, what her father required. But watching you unravel the truth, seeing how readily people believe the stories they tell themselves rather than observing what is actually present before them, it occurred to me that I had perhaps made an assumption I should have questioned. I would very much like to ask Catherine if she would be willing to reconsider our previous understanding." Catherine's expression transformed with such sudden joy that Miss Marple felt a small but genuine satisfaction bloom in her chest. These young people had been given a second opportunity that few received, and they seemed determined to navigate it with greater wisdom than they had possessed previously. As the carriage was brought round to convey Miss Marple to the station, she took one final look at Thornfield Manor, standing proud against the autumn sky with its red brick and climbing ivy. The blue vase that had faced the window was gone, replaced by something simpler and less precious. But the household that the vase had belonged to seemed, paradoxically, considerably richer for having lost it. The village car rattled down the drive, and Miss Marple settled back against the seat, her knitting already emerging from her bag. Her companion on the journey would be a book of local history, a subject that held particular fascination for her, given that she had spent the better part of 2 weeks observing how the patterns of human behavior remained remarkably consistent across generations and circumstances. Back at Thornfield, as the household watched the carriage disappear beyond the hedgerow, Richard turned to his assembled family with an expression that suggested he had reached some internal resolution. "I think," he said slowly, "that we should begin the business of rebuilding. Not merely financially, though that will be necessary, but emotionally. We have been given the opportunity to become something better than we were before, more honest, more understanding, more willing to acknowledge the complexities of human nature rather than hiding from them." Catherine took his arm, and Martin placed his hand supportively on Richard's shoulder. Patricia, observing this tableau of tentative reconciliation, smiled with the particular understanding of someone who had spent her life outside a family circle and had finally been invited to stand within it. And in that moment, as autumn deepened toward winter and the village prepared for the changing season, Thornfield Manor became something it had never been before, a household where truth, however painful, had been chosen over comfortable deception, where secrets had been exposed to light and air, and where the human capacity for forgiveness and understanding had been tested and against considerable odds had prevailed. Miss Marple, riding toward the station with her knitting needles clicking their familiar rhythm, smiled to herself with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that this was precisely how mysteries should resolve, not with dramatic revelations and theatrical justice, but with the slow, steady work of human beings attempting to do better than they had done before, armed with the terrible knowledge that truth, once revealed, could never be hidden again.